Hello, friends. Welcome to a nice live stream with Bhante Suddhaso here at Empty Cloud, contemplating something that never grows old, which is death. Always there, always happening around us, and soon we'll have to contemplate it in this very moment. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Bhante Suddhaso.
So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Good morning, friends. This morning we'll be looking at discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya from the Book of the Sixes, Sutta number 20. So Anguttara Nikaya 6.20. And the sutta is one of two Maranasati suttas, which is mindfulness of death, or mindfulness of dying, if we want to be more precise. So the Pali word marana, it's usually translated simply as death, but it's actually a present participle. So then a more accurate translation is dying. And I find this quite significant, actually, because many people say, oh, I'm not afraid of death, but I am afraid of dying. So there's a distinction here. We tend to think of death as a single instant, a single incredibly brief instant of transition. And that's not particularly terrifying, actually. In fact, there's not really anything terrifying about that at all, unless you're someone who's desperately afraid of new things. Then it can be a bit disturbing. But let's be realistic. If you're afraid of new things, you're afraid all the time, because every moment is a new thing. Anyway, so we tend to think of death as a single moment in time, a single and possibly brief instant. But dying, on the other hand, can be a quite protracted, drawn out, and decidedly uncomfortable experience. So I do think it's notable that the Buddha used the present participle form, so dying, mindfulness of dying, rather than the word death as we would say it in English. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and give some explanations. This one is not particularly long and it's not particularly complicated, so we might get through this fairly quickly. Please feel free to enter questions at any time and I'll answer them at the end. The sutta begins. On one occasion, the fortunate one was dwelling at Natika in the brick hall. There, the fortunate one addressed the monks. So this is the Buddha speaking. Monks, when mindfulness of death is developed and advanced, it is of great fruit and great benefit, leading into the deathless, concluding in the deathless. Monks, how can mindfulness of death be developed and advanced such that it is of great fruit and great benefit, leads to the deathless, and concludes in the deathless? So this is the introductory paragraph to the sutta. So the Buddha, he starts off by saying that mindfulness of death is something which is really good to do. It's very beneficial. So this is not something minor or insignificant, but it's something of great value. And he also says that when it's fully developed, when it's fully practiced, it leads all the way to full enlightenment. And I find it notable here that in talking about enlightenment, the goal of the path here, he uses the term the deathless, which is quite relevant given that he's talking about mindfulness of death. So what is the deathless? The deathless is nibbana. So elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha defines nibbana as that which is not born and does not die, that which does not come into being and does not cease to be, that which is never arising and never ceasing, that which cannot be defined in terms of existence or non-existence, that which cannot be defined in terms of characteristics or details. So this is what the Buddha called the nibbana dhatu, the element of the unconditioned, the element of the deathless. So by paying attention to death, we can realize the deathless. By being fully aware of the process of dying, we can become aware of that which never dies. So this is a very interesting statement. So if you really want to get away from death, then you need to pay attention to death. If you really want to be free of dying, then you need to pay attention to dying. And this is quite significant. Once again, many people go through their lives trying to convince themselves that death will never happen to them, or that if it does happen, it will happen at some distant point somewhere in the future, and hopefully quietly in their sleep. But realistically, that's usually not how death goes. Death tends to be messy and complicated and painful and protracted. And we have no idea when it's going to happen or how it's going to happen. But one thing we know is that it will happen eventually. And of course, we've also died countless times in the past. This is not the first time around, and it's probably not going to be the last time. So it's something which we clearly don't understand very well. And for most people, there's a deep fear of death, deep fear of the dying process. For a small number of people, there's something exciting about death. There's something alluring about it, but that's also coming from delusion. So those who fear death are coming from delusion, and those who look forward to death are also coming from delusion. So we need to have a clear understanding of the nature of death, to be cognizant of it, to know that it's coming with clarity of mind, so not blurred by fear or confusion. So the Buddha in the suttas, he gives several different ways of contemplating death, several ways of practicing mindfulness of death. And one of the more well-known ones is actually the sutta immediately prior to this one, where the Buddha asks a group of monks, how do you practice mindfulness of death? And one of them says, oh, every day I think I might die before the night comes. And every night I think I might die before the day comes. And the Buddha's like, okay, that's one way. And then the next person is like, well, every time I'm eating a meal, I think I might die before the meal ends. And so then it goes on until you get to the person who says, with every in-breath, I think I might die before I get to the next out-breath. With every out-breath, I think I might die before I get to the next in-breath. And in that one, the Buddha, he calls the first couple of people lazy. And he says it's only the people who are reflecting on death in the matter of a few seconds, like I might die sometime the next few seconds. He said only those people are actually practicing correctly. So that sutta is very famous. It's very well known. This one, for some reason, is much less well known, even though I've always liked it quite a bit more than the previous one. So that's why I selected this one to focus on. So the Buddha goes into the contemplation that he recommends. He says, "Hear, monks, when the day is ending and the night is returning, a monk considers, there are many causes of death. A snake might bite me, or a scorpion might sting me, or a centipede might sting me, and I might die as a result. That would be inconvenient for me. So I find this incredibly amusing. So the suttas are full of a lot of subtle, dry humor, and this is one example of that. It's like, I might die as a result. That would be inconvenient for me. It's like, well, understatement. Or I might stumble and fall, or a meal I've eaten might make me sick. Um, I can relate to this one, as I often have trouble with food. It says, or my bile could become disturbed, or my phlegm might become disturbed, or knife-like winds might disturb me. So knife-like winds, this is one way that pain was spoken about. So this was a general statement referring to any kind of internal bodily disorder that caused severe pain. So it was spoken about as being like having sharp winds slicing through your body. And it carries on and says, knife-like winds might disturb me, and I might die as a result. That would be inconvenient for me. Monks should consider, are there any harmful, unwholesome phenomena in me that have not been abandoned, and which would be obstructive to me if I were to die tonight? In other words, are there any defilements present in my mind? Is there any greed, hatred, or delusion? Desire, aversion, confusion? Is there any restlessness or dullness in the mind? Is there any doubt or misunderstanding? So we should constantly be investigating. It's like, well, reflecting that I could die at any time in any one of a number of different ways. And if I die at this time, how's it going to be? Is my mind pure? Pure enough that I'll have a good death? Pure enough that if I'm still within samsara, I'll at least get a pleasant rebirth? Or if my mind is well purified, pure enough that I might attain some stage of awakening? Or on the contrary, is my mind still prone to greed, hatred, and delusion, such that if I were to die, I would be heading to a less pleasant state of existence, a less pleasant rebirth? So either a less pleasant form of human existence or possibly falling into one of the lower realms. And slipping away from the Buddhist path, slipping away from the opportunity for awakening. And so the Buddha carries on. He says, monks, when a monk is reflecting in this way, if he knows there are harmful, unwholesome phenomena in me that have not been abandoned and which would be obstructive to me if I were to die tonight, then that monk should produce extraordinary interest, effort, exertion, and striving with unfailing mindfulness and awareness in order to abandon those harmful, unwholesome phenomena. Monks, just as a person whose clothing or head was on fire would, in order to extinguish their clothing or head, produce extraordinary interest, effort, exertion, and striving with unfailing mindfulness and awareness, in the same way, monks should produce extraordinary interest, effort, exertion, and striving with unfailing mindfulness and awareness in order to abandon those harmful, unwholesome phenomena. So here we see the Buddha bringing in a simile that appears in a number of places in the suttas. So the image of someone whose clothes or head is on fire. So what do you do when your clothes are on fire? Do you just think, oh, well, no big deal. Clothes are on fire. At least I'm warm. After this cold winter, it's nice that I'm at least warm for a change. Or your head's on fire. What do you do when your clothing or your head is on fire? Well, it consumes your full attention. You devote all your effort to trying to extinguish that fire because you know that it could be a disaster for you. It could cause serious crippling injuries, deforming injuries. It could even kill you. So naturally, you put forth an extraordinary effort to extinguish the fire. So we should see it the same way with defilements. Defilements are like when your clothes are on fire, when your head is on fire. You should see it with the same urgency, the same urgent need to extinguish the fire as soon as possible. And this image of defilements as being like fire is something that we see all throughout the suttas. So what is the nature of fire? So fire is agitating. It's uncomfortable. It's painful. It's destructive. It's something which, if not controlled, can cause disasters. And by contrast, he uses the word nibbana, which literally means, well, it has a few literal meanings, but one meaning is cooling or extinguishing. So it's extinguishing those fires, those painful, agitating, destructive fires from the mind. There's a few other ways of translating the word nibbana, but that one is relevant to this metaphor. So once again, this reflection, reflecting the many ways that one might die. Again, we tend to think, oh, well, I'll just die quietly in my old age, and whatever old age is for you. So maybe you think, oh, I'll die in 40 or 50 years, 60 years even. Or if you're a bit on the older side, you might think, well, I might die in 10 or 20 years or even 1 year. But either way, this is actually fantastically ridiculous to think that we know a certainty that our death is not going to be anytime soon. We actually have no idea. So one of the fun little things in medical science is the phenomenon of spontaneous brain aneurysms. I like to reflect on this every now and then. So every now and then, for no apparent medical reason, somebody's blood vessels in their brain just spontaneously explodes and they die. And this happens extremely quickly. So someone can go from seemingly completely healthy to completely dead in a matter of seconds. So this could happen to anyone in this room at any time. Any one of us might just brain pops and they fall over dead at any time. And of course, there's all the ordinary dangers and difficulties. So poisonous snakes, and scorpions, and centipedes were apparently an ongoing and present problem in northern India at the time of the Buddha. Those of us who are living in more sanitized environments don't have to worry so much about poisonous animals per se, but you might have to worry about poisonous people, other humans who are filled with defilements and who are prone to violence and might choose to shorten your lifespan significantly. And of course, there's always the risk of illness. That's very present these days with the pandemic, which has now killed, 500,000 people in this country alone. Pretty mind-blowing. I remember when the pandemic started, and I was one of the alarmists who was saying, this thing is going to kill 100,000 people before it stops. Turns out I was underestimating by a very large margin. But at the time, a lot of people were mocking me. They were like, no, it's going to go away in a few weeks. What are you talking, 100,000? That's a crazy number. Turns out it was a crazy number in the sense that it was way too small. So death from illness is a very apparent thing these days. Death from food. Death from food can be caused by severe allergic reactions. But that's actually less common than you might think. Can be caused by rotten food, which, especially if you're into eating meat, then rotten meat can be a serious problem. But again, these days, not such a big deal in the sanitized lives that we tend to lead these days. What's more of a problem is the gradual slow death caused by all the toxic chemicals they put in food these days, slowly wearing your body down from the inside out. So we do need to be aware of this, aware that every time you eat something, that might be the cause of your death, sooner or later. And the example of stumbling and falling. So every time you go up or down a flight of stairs, you can reflect, well, this might be the end of my life right here. I might slip on one of these steps and fall down and break my neck. You don't even need to fall very far. There are recorded incidents of people dying from falling down 4 steps. Don't even need to fall down a whole flight of stairs. Just 4 steps is enough of a distance to break your neck. Pretty exciting, eh? Do you realize that every time you go up or down a flight of stairs, you're risking your life? No joke. Completely true. Or you could fall and hit your head on the edge of a table. Another way that you can die. Again, there's no shortage of ways that you might die. So again, this is the reflection that the Buddha is offering here. And note that he's actually getting into specific details. This is another thing which I quite like about for example, the Girimananda Sutta. In the Girimananda Sutta, where the Buddha starts talking about the drawbacks of physical bodies, he goes into this long list of a couple dozen different kinds of illnesses. Actually, more than that, probably about 30 or so. I've never bothered to count. But it's really beautiful to chant as well, because it's just like the word for illness is abada. So you're like abada, abada, abada. So it's just going through this long list of illness, and it always puts a smile on my face. Because it's so real. It's so real. It's like, oh yeah, there's eye sicknesses, and there's ear sicknesses, and there's nose sicknesses, and there's stomach sicknesses, and there's jaundice, and there's leprosy, and there's diarrhea, and there's like, he just goes on and on and on and on and on until finally just the sheer overload finally hits you, and you're like, oh, this body is a festering massive disease. I get it. I get it. So in the same way, actually going through in detail all the different ways that you can die. And if you're prone to creativity, this is not difficult. You can come up with a very long list of possible ways you could die in a very short amount of time. If you're less creative, well, the internet is your friend. Look on the internet for listings of ways that you can die unexpectedly and suddenly. And you'll find other people who are more creative than you have come up with very long lists of many ways which you could spontaneously die in a matter of a few moments. And as the sutta says, well, and if we die, that would be inconvenient. And why would that be inconvenient? Well, if you haven't attained enlightenment yet, and you die, you don't know where you're going to wind up next, what kind of life you're going to have, whether or not you're going to contact the Buddha's teachings. Probably won't, by the way, just to be perfectly realistic here. Whether you're even going to be born as a human. One of the suttas where the Buddha talks about the odds of rebirth in different realms, he speaks about the odds of being reborn as a human. And he says there are many beings who, when they pass away as humans, they are reborn in the lower realms. Comparatively, very few are reborn as humans or devas. So odds are, let's just be completely realistic here. Odds are, if we die at this time, we're not going to a good destination. Odds are we're not going to be going somewhere where we hear the Dhamma. We're not going to be born in conditions where we can practice Buddhism well. Probably not. No, it's possible, but probably not. So even just reflecting in this lifetime, what have we done? What have we done in this lifetime? In this lifetime, what percentage of our time and effort has been spent diligently pursuing the Buddha's teachings? And what percentage of our time and effort has been spent diligently fueling our defilements? Do the math. It's not very encouraging. Even if you've been practicing for more than half your life, as I have, well, how much of that time has been spent really diligently practicing? How many days have we spent where, well, part of the day we were developing wholesome states of mind, part of the day we were spent developing compassion and thoughtfulness and respectfulness and mindfulness and equanimity and so on. But part of the day was spent cultivating irritation, aversion, dullness, desire, confusion. Not very encouraging, is it, when you start to add up the numbers? So, if we might die at any time, and so far, the bulk of karma that we've generated in this life is leading away from the path. And realistically, the bulk of karma from our past lives is also leading away from the Buddhist path. What does that tell you about your future lives? Probably leading away from the Buddhist path. Probably not leading towards awakening. Just being completely realistic here. So, let's get to it. What are we waiting for? Let's start turning this mind around. When you recognize that your ship is heading directly towards the iceberg, well, it's time to start changing direction, isn't it? When you realize that your car is driving directly at the edge of a cliff, well, it's time to turn around, isn't it? Well, let's turn the ship around. Let's get our mind pointed in the right direction. Let's reorient the mind so that it's pointed unerringly towards the Dhamma and not towards anything else. So that's the reflection here. It's reflecting. It's like, well, if I died right now, what would happen? If I died right now, what's the momentum of my mind? And we realize it's not that great. It's really not. So I need to get things sorted out as soon as possible. And one of the values of going through a number of real life examples of ways that you really might die is it makes it real. So one thing I've noticed when talking about death, because as a Buddhist monk, we talk about death a lot. And in fact, I often, as I go throughout the day, I have a number of little mantras that I recite to myself as I go throughout the day. And one of my favorites is, we're all gonna die. I go throughout my day and I'm thinking, we're all gonna die, we're all gonna die, we're all gonna die. Sometimes I vocalize it, which can be a little awkward in public. So I often wonder, like I'd be on the subway in New York City and I'm like, we're all gonna die, we're all gonna die. And I'm just like, oh, I hope nobody heard that. Or actually, I hope they did hear it, because seriously, people need to remember these things. We're all gonna die. We're all going to die. All of us, including me. We really need to remind ourselves of this, because we lose sight of it so easily. We get so wrapped up in silly, petty pursuits that we forget. We forget what we're doing. One of the lines I remember from my Zen days, it's very short, very punchy. It goes simply, great is the matter of birth and death. And it carries on from there, but I've actually forgotten the rest of it. But I've never forgotten that phrase. Great is the matter of birth and death. In other words, this issue of living and dying and living and dying and living and dying, this is a really, really big deal, because this is the cycle of suffering that we're caught in. And if we don't come to an honest recognition and understanding of it, then we're just going to keep being caught in it. It's going to keep cycling through, one death after another. one painful birth after another, one painful life after another, and one painful death after another. So we're really trying to make it a real awareness. So again, I've met a lot of people who, for them, death is this weird, vague abstraction, which they're kind of aware that death is a thing, and it's something which happens. And one day, Grandma went to sleep and didn't wake up again, and that's death. And one day, little Fluffy went to sleep and didn't wake up again, and that's death. And it's like, no, death is you falling down the stairs and cracking your head against the wall, bleeding horribly, painfully to death over the course of several minutes. That's you, your real experience. It's you walking through the forest and a snake bites your leg, and you collapse to the ground, frothing from the mouth as venom courses painfully through your veins. And your body slowly rots from the inside out because they can't get you to the doctor quickly enough. This is you dying painfully. It's not some weird abstraction. It's not some nice dream. It's a real, painful, inescapable reality. Make it real. That's what the Buddha is getting at here. Death is not some weird, vague, dreamlike abstraction. It's physical, real, it's painful, and it's going to happen. We need to face this fact. Don't turn away from it. Turn towards it. Look at it. See it for what it is. And if this makes you uncomfortable, good. Look at that discomfort. Ask yourself, why is it uncomfortable to face this fact? It's the way life is. Why is that uncomfortable? And it's uncomfortable because of our own defilements. So we need to acknowledge that. And we need to look at that. Because those defilements are exactly why we're suffering. It's not death that makes us suffer. It's our defilements in relation to the subject of death that makes us suffer. So then the Buddha says, however, monks, when a monk is reflecting in this way, if he knows, there are no harmful, unwholesome phenomena in me that have not been abandoned and which would be obstructive to me if I were to die tonight, then monks, that monk is to live with euphoria and happiness, training day and night in wholesome phenomena. In other words, if when you're reflecting on the inevitability of death, and you look at your mind and you realize that your mind is actually really wholesome and pure, then you feel happy. So again, most people, when they reflect on death, they feel a sense of anxiety and agitation and disturbance. But if your mind is wholesome and pure, dominated by wholesome mind states and wholesome tendencies, then reflecting on death will fill you with joy because you know you have nothing to fear. You'll know that your mind is pointed in the right direction and that therefore death has no hold over you. There's nothing that you need to be worried about or disturbed by. And then the Buddha applies the same reflection. So when the night is ending and the day is returning, and the Buddha goes through the same reflection. So you'll notice here that the Buddha's, he's giving us at these two turning points. So one is the point where the day is turning into the night. So at dusk, so that's a major transition time, is as the light fades from the sky and we enter the darkness of night, which is quite significant because, well, what is the darkness of night? It's a state of uncertainty, a state of confusion, a state of danger. So that's something which reminds us. It's a reminder of the inevitability of death. And then conversely, the transition from night to day. So the day is returning, so there's that sense of possibility, of hopefulness. Well, just as there's the possibility and hopefulness in purifying this mind, so that death will hold no fear for us. But also as we go throughout our daily activities, well, there's a lot of opportunity for disaster and misfortune. When you're sleeping quietly in your bed at night, well, that's actually pretty safe, isn't it? But as you're going throughout your day, well, here comes a drunk driver. Bam! Mindfulness of death. Better be aware. It could happen at any time. So the Buddha is emphasizing these two transition times. So the day turning into night and the night turning into day. But as indicated in the previous sutta, we should actually be reflecting on this all the time. So constantly aware that death is coming, constantly aware that death is real, it's inevitable, it's inescapable. And that if there are any unwholesome tendencies present in our mind, then that's going to be a serious problem when death comes. So we should make this constant effort to purify our mind. Again, just as if our clothes was on fire, we would make an effort to extinguish our clothes. If our head was on fire, we'd make an effort to extinguish our head. Well, the truth is our mind is on fire. So we should make an effort to extinguish our mind. Our mind is burning with greed, hatred, and delusion. And so we need to make an effort to put out the fires. There was a cute story I heard recently of a Buddhist monk from Sri Lanka, and he met with the firefighter chief. And the firefighter chief was saying, "Oh, I'm a firefighter. I put out fires for a living." And the monk says, "Oh, me too. I'm also a firefighter. I put out fires for a living too." And the firefighter was like, "What are you talking about? You're a monk." And he was like, "Well, I put out the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion." So I thought that was adorable. So apparently I'm a firefighter. So once again, we're trying to extinguish the fires of the mind, which are just as disastrous as physical fire. In fact, far more so. So physical fire comes and it goes. Ultimately, in the long run, it's not really a problem. But when the mind is on fire, that will keep dragging us through one life of suffering after another. So at some point, we need to learn how to extinguish these fires. And recognizing that we've been caught in the cycle of suffering for longer than we can possibly remember. So living through one painful life and painful death after another. Hundreds, thousands, millions of lifetimes. And so far, we haven't found any solution. But now we have a possible solution in front of us. And what do? We waste time. What do? We feed the fires. How deranged is that? We have an opportunity to extinguish the fires, and instead we fuel them. How crazy is that? But when we reflect on death in this way, then that can help to encourage us to really take the Buddha's teaching seriously, and to really commit ourselves with sincerity and enthusiasm to the Buddha's path. So I think that's all I have to say on this sutta. So at this time, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in and I'll answer them as best I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Well, there are a lot of comments of appreciation and also some amusing comments. Like, for example, Jay says, saying we're all going to die in public is a good way of social distancing. But welcome to all our friends online. Jens, Elaine, Kyle, good to see you, friends. Elaine says it is D-Day, practicing equanimity, so won't say this is the best day of the week, rather count as a blessing. D-Day.
Dhamma Day.
Oh, Dhamma Day.
Oh,
I see.
That day.
That day. Okay. My ESL sometimes gets a little confused with initials and acronyms. And the cows are friends. Good to see you. Duktam, Geeta, Melissa, Dharmasi, lots of friends. Nancy asks, Bhante Suddhaso mentioned the sutta on death before this one. What is it called?
Well, properly speaking, the one that we just went through today is called Dutiya Maranasati Sutta. So the second discourse on mindfulness of death, of dying. The previous one is just called Maranasati Sutta. So the first sutta on mindfulness of death. But if you just go back one, so this was Anguttara Nikaya 620, just go back to 619.
Great. And hello to Manuel. Oh, actually, Jens had also replied in terms of the sutta before that.
Good.
Jens is on top of it. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And Nancy asks, aren't we always dying? The limitation of bodily existence seems to mean that dying is always with us. Am I caught in an illusion? We have illness before we know about it.
I mean, that's one way of talking. One way of talking is that from the moment you're born, you're dying, in the sense that you're moving towards death. The main danger I see in reflecting is that that's another way of avoiding facing death. If you're like, oh, well, we're always dying all the time anyway. Well, that's just another way of avoiding actually really looking at what dying is. It's another way of avoiding thinking about death. So on the one hand, that reflection can be useful if it helps you remember that death is inevitable. But it can also, again, it can also just be another way of avoiding really genuinely thinking about death. So be careful with that way of thinking.
Nancy also says, I think about this dying on steps all the time. And Jay suggests, if you've seen any of the Final Destination movies, you can realize so many ways to die. I have not seen them, so I'm not sure what he's talking about.
They made more than one. I only saw the first one when I was a teenager.
Well, apparently it gives you a lot of inspiration on possible ways to die. And Nancy got a little bit sad at the thought of the percentage of time that we spend fueling our defilements, but says also, I'm loving this discourse.
Oh, good. Good. That's one of my favorites.
All right, lots of words of appreciation. And Gita says, golden words, Bhante, our mind is on fire. So true. Jens says, I think the stairs there are especially deadly. It's pretty easy to envision falling and dying on them. We did have a resident actually fall from the stairs, and since she's fallen and hurt herself on Toilette, whenever I'm on the stairs, I'm not sure if I contemplate dying, but I definitely contemplate hurting myself a lot. And Kauser friend asks, can we also take mindfulness of death as a meditation subject during sitting practice?
Yeah.
And hello to Kumu and Michael, who says, great sutta, late finding you. Oh. And it seems like that's all for this morning. If there are maybe some residents that want to ask questions or...
Anything? No?
They're all contemplating that.
And we have a question on Instagram that says, what's your take on suicide?
Don't do it. That's it. Yeah, don't do it. So the Buddha said that killing a living being is unwholesome. No exceptions are made for whether it's yourself or another being. So killing a living being is unwholesome. Therefore, suicide is unwholesome and leads to unpleasant consequences in future lives. So it's not to be done. Sometimes people get this misunderstanding of thinking that suicide is okay in Buddhism, based upon a couple of of kind of strange, obscure passages which are of unclear meaning. But if you read through the suttas, the Buddha is pretty unequivocally, absolutely clear over and over and over and over and over again that taking the life of any living being is unwholesome and produces harmful results. And there's nowhere where he says there's an exception for suicide, anywhere. So just to be clear on that, it's not to be done.
Thank you, Bhante. And
I have a related question to that, though.
Go ahead.
Euthanasia, which may have been on your mind, which is not exactly suicide, but it's assisted death for people who are in agony.
So Brother Diamond is asking about euthanasia, and particularly he mentioned assisted euthanasia. Yeah, also from a Buddhist standpoint, that's still taking the life of a living being, so still not to be done. So definitely euthanizing other sentient beings, which includes animals, by the way. So euthanasia is just a fancy word for murder. So let's just be clear here. So let's just use the word murder. Murdering your pets is unwholesome. Paying a doctor to murder your pets is hiring an assassin. Definitely unwholesome. And even more so when we're dealing with humans. So yeah, euthanasia, again, people like to use fancy Greek words. Euthanasia is Greek for good death. But let's be realistic. It's murder. Let's skip the fancy words and just call it what it is. So don't murder your pets, don't murder your friends, don't murder your family, and don't murder yourself. Of course, this is not okay. Just blows my mind that anyone could think it was okay.
And we have another question on Instagram, which is, what is your advice about dealing with grief?
So that's a whole other topic, and that's actually quite, that's not something which lends itself well to a quick, short answer. And we've also given talks on it in the past. So short answer is, I would say, look on our YouTube channel for the past talks we've given on the subject of grief. If you can't find it, send us an email or a message and we'll help you find it. Also, mindfulness of emotion relates to that to a large degree.
but we're also going to be doing a talk, actually.
Oh,
I think I am scheduled for it, actually.
Oh, so
in the next couple of days or weeks. I don't know.
specifically grief?
Yes.
Oh, great. Stay tuned. There's a talk, we're talking about it again soon, apparently.
And Dharmasiri on Facebook says, if you're practicing this quality of life, we can take away from all the attachments. Am I correct?
I don't understand the question.
Me neither. Do you understand? Okay. Maybe, Dharmasiri, if you can elaborate a little better, that would be good. So we can rephrase it for Bhante. Kumu is reflecting that cells in our body die all the time. And Nancy says, thank you for empowering us to think about dying. I have thought about this since I was a child, and others suggest I'm a weirdo.
Or a Buddhist, as the case may be.
And Michael asks, in many cases, to eschew euthanasia is to enable deathly suffering. Just saying. Oh, it's not a question, it's a comment. Sorry.
Yeah, so that is a fact. There is such a thing as pain. I'm not convinced that pain is an excuse for killing. I don't see any evidence of that anywhere in the Buddhist teachings. So I don't know where this idea comes from. There's actually an interesting story. It's from a Zen teacher. I don't remember who off the top of my head. But they came across a deer which had somehow managed to get caught and severely injured, and it was dying. So they saw this deer, and the deer was in the process of dying. And it looked like it was actually in a tremendous amount of pain, but the deer was remarkably calm and peaceful. And then one of the people who was with this person said, well, we should put it out of its misery. So they got an axe, and that was when the deer started to get terrified. So before, when they were just letting the deer slowly bleed to death in what you might call a horrible, painful way, the deer was actually facing it with a certain degree of serenity. But when they came at it with an axe to try to put it out of its misery, then the deer became terrified and started resisting. So, and then again, the Zen teacher said that they were filled with incredible remorse that they had chosen to do that, that it was not the right choice. It was not the appropriate course of action. That they could see that they were actually making things worse. In this idea that they were making it better, they were actually making it worse. So I'm not a fan of this idea of putting someone out of their misery. I'm not a fan of this idea. We don't know. We don't know what's going on with that person. We don't know what might happen next. We don't know what their condition is. And when you start playing God in that way, from a place of delusion, that gets messy. And also often when people say, I mean, especially in the case of pets, when they say, oh, I'm just putting Fluffy out of her misery, what they actually mean is, I'm sick of taking care of this being. I'm sick of looking after a chronically ill dog. So I'm putting out my own misery, the misery of taking care of a chronically ill pet. That's often what they're actually saying. So they justify as saying, oh, well, I'm putting Fluffy out of her misery. But actually, that's not the case at all. They just don't want to face the fact of a natural death. So again, I'm not comfortable at all with this idea of justifying euthanasia as being a way of putting somebody out of their misery. So I am in the camp of allowing beings to die naturally in their own way. And we don't need to accelerate the process. And in my own case, so just reflecting on death, as death comes, it's going to be one of two cases. Either one, I'm enlightened, in which case I'm not going to be bothered by death. Or two, I'm not yet enlightened, which means I need all the time I can get to try to get enlightened before death comes. So do not accelerate my death, because you might be cutting off those crucial last few minutes of practice when I could attain enlightenment. And if I'm already enlightened, then it doesn't matter how long or painful my death is, because I won't be bothered. So from a Buddhist standpoint, I actually cannot justify accelerating death at all. I can't see any way to fit that into the Dhamma. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't find a way to fit it in. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Bhante. And well, I think you answered Michael's question, which was saying allowing death to come as opposed to killing is different. So I think you just addressed that.
Yeah. So, for example, discontinuing life support. The monks who I've received training from say that discontinuing life support is not killing. It's just letting the body do what the body is doing anyway. Yeah, it's not the same as killing.
And Kauser friend asks, if thinking of death leads to anxiety, is this not a hindrance?
Well, you need to examine why you're feeling anxiety. Why does thinking about death make you anxious? Death is natural. It's just a part of it's just a part of life. It's just a part of nature. It's the natural course of bodies and minds. So why does it make you anxious? Take a look at that anxiety. Practice mindfulness of emotion. What is that emotion of anxiety? What does it feel like? Become intimate and comfortable with the feeling of anxiety. So that's an opportunity, actually. But if it gets overwhelming, well, then take a break. Do a different meditation for a while. Maybe do some loving kindness meditation. That's always a good alternative. In fact, I've known many teachers who say that if you're going to make mindfulness of death a regular part of your practice, then you should be doing metta in equal measure. If you're going to do an hour of mindfulness of death, you should do an hour of metta. Because that helps to balance the mind. So the brightness and joyfulness and vitality and liveliness of metta helps to keep the mind from sinking into anxiety or despair when it's doing mindfulness of death. But actually, if you're doing mindfulness of death properly, then what comes up is not anxiety, but rather a sense of serenity. That's its actual purpose. Okay.
Right, and we have Dharma Siddhi, who has explained better what they were trying to say, to ask. If you're practicing this way, we can dying anytime. All our attachments to anger go away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, and Nancy asks, I read this past week that some Buddhists believe chanting the Heart Sutra while someone is dying helps the person connect to higher consciousness. Thoughts?
I mean, it's a very old and traditional Buddhist practice to chant Buddhist suttas while somebody is dying, or to recite the Buddha's name. I think it's a wonderful thing to do. It's helping somebody to maintain an affinity with Buddhism as they're transitioning into their next life. So definitely that can help them establish good conditions for their next life. Yeah, I think it's a good thing to do for sure.
Thank you. And Annie says, I was once told since it takes more effort to kill a large creature, karma accumulated is greater than when killing a smaller creature, according to the 5 factors in Panatipata. Your thoughts, Bhante?
So the factor of intention is a critical element in karma. And also effort is a critical component. I'm a little hesitant to just draw this direct line between size of being because, for example, a whale is a lot bigger than a human, but it's generally accepted that killing a human is stronger karma than killing an animal of any sort. But there definitely is a component. So killing a mosquito, I would say, is definitely lighter karma, weaker karma than killing a cat, for example. But ultimately, you don't want to get into this kind of accountant mentality. Just don't kill. Treat every living being as though it was your mother. This is assuming you're on good terms with your mother. Treat every living being as though it was your best friend. There we go. That's better, which may or may not be your mother. You should also treat your mother as your best friend.
And Nancy asks, should we consider doing the most compostable death rituals post-mortem? For example, ashes scattered?
Yeah, you could. Sure. Yeah, if you're doing that with a mind of compassion, so thinking into the future, how can I make my death the least harm to the planet and the most benefit? That's a compassionate way of doing things. Yeah.
And on Instagram, there's a question, what about the idea of death of the old self? I know it's not the same as a physical action, but maybe killing I can't see the rest of the question, actually. Maybe killing a previous something. Let's see. Very strange.
Well, just to answer what I think you're asking, so there is no persistent ongoing self, which means there is no self which can be said is killed. But rather in each moment, there is the illusion of a self entity. And that illusion comes into being and ceases to exist immediately, instantaneously. So if you want to talk in those terms, then self is being born and dying in every single moment, but it's not who we are. It's just a temporary confluence of conditions, a temporary confluence of impermanent phenomena. So that has nothing whatsoever to do with killing. and it's not really related to the subject of death. But there's a way of talking where you can say that we're born and we die in every moment. There's a way of talking, and there can be benefit to reflecting on that, as long as it doesn't lead to us losing sight of the reality of physical death. Again, we don't want to use this as kind of a way of avoiding facing the inevitability of death. Anything else?
I actually think you answered it. They clarified, but yeah.
Okay.
And Nancy says, when the world opens up, could Empty Cloud ever consider doing retreats on death and dying and metta? Oh yeah, all the time. I used to do them on a regular basis.
Yeah, I used to do mindfulness of death from time to time. Yep.
On Instagram, there's a question. I believe that the difficulty with killing others to put them out of misery is that if the other is suffering, isn't there a realistic judgment involved?
Well, we are judging for them whether or not they want to die early. I am not comfortable making those judgments for somebody else. And if they directly asked to die early, well, I would have to say, well, I'm sorry, I've taken a vow of not killing. So it just isn't an option for me. Instead, what I would do in that situation is to teach them mindfulness of pain and how to cultivate equanimity towards pain, which is something you should be practicing all the time, even when you're healthy, because then when pain comes, you'll be prepared. It's hard to develop equanimity towards pain on your deathbed if you haven't been practicing it for your entire life. So start now.
Thank you, Bhante. Jessica actually says exactly that. Thank you, Bhante. Good to hear you, Jessica de Marville. And Yudi says, I killed a fly the other day. It had been haunting me for 4 days. I gave it several chances to fly away, but the fly was stubborn. I felt really bad after. How can I purify this karma?
Well, first off, recognize I did something unwholesome based on my defilements. I will try to purify my mind so that I am less tempted in the future. I will do my best to avoid harming or killing any living being ever again. Then for the one that you killed, then wish for it to have a happy rebirth, a pleasant life in the future, for it to encounter the Dhamma and to attain awakening. So wishing good thoughts for the little friend that you killed. I also recommend getting a butterfly net. So butterfly nets are a great way of catching flies and other insects and then releasing them outside. It's much easier than the old cup and paper trick. That only really works for spiders. It doesn't work so well for flying insects. Butterfly nets. So my preceptor, Ajahn Pasano, I don't know these days, but when I was at his monastery, he was a master at catching flies in a butterfly net and taking them out of the meditation hall. I remember one time he held it up and he had something like 40 flies caught in the butterfly net. I was really impressed. You still use it. Okay.
Great. All right. And hello to also Stella, who says, I'm from the Philippines. Good to see you. And Jay says, I also have a problem with not killing cockroaches. If I don't kill them, they will take over the house.
Yeah, that's a difficult situation. But actually, one thing you can do is keep everything spotlessly, perfectly clean so that there's nothing for the cockroaches to eat. And they might eventually give up and go away. Otherwise, you're just going to have to learn how to live with them or move somewhere else. But you don't want the karma of killing. You really don't.
Jessica says, I use a bug catcher. It requires patience and analysis of the fly's behavior, but works wonders. Blocks holes too. Oh, block holes too.
Great.
Yeah, great. Yeah, when we start practicing non-harming, we get very creative. We become artists. And very clean too. All right, so I think that's all for this morning. Thank you so much, Bhante, for sharing your wisdom with us. And thank you, everybody, for joining in this morning. So we will be meeting again this evening at 7:30 p.m. New York City time, and again tomorrow, 8 a.m., 7:30 p.m., and Friday, 8 a.m., 7:30 p.m. On Friday, we'll have, as usual, our monk chat. So you'll have a panel of 3 monastics where you can ask all your Dharma questions. So if you don't have a, question, if the topics that we'll be talking about in the next couple of days aren't exactly the questions that you want to ask, you can bring them on Friday evening. All right, so we can end the morning with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.